After spending most of the last decade as a support studio on Battlefront and Battlefield, Criterion Games is back with a full-fledged arcade racing adventure. Need for Speed Unbound is a boldly stylized open-world racer, with graffiti-inspired particle effects and cel-shaded character models. Criterion Games' last full-fledged titles were a pair of critically acclaimed Need for Speed games, Hot Pursuit and Most Wanted. So is Unbound a worthy sequel to those great racers? And do the new visual effects impress, or are they an unwelcome distraction? Need for Speed Unbound makes a brilliant first impression. Car exhaust and tire smoke have been replaced with colorful, stark particle effects, and all sorts of actions, like hitting boost or nailing a jump, spawn bright sketched highlights. It's sort of reminiscent of 2005's SSX on Tour, though much more extensive here. If we dissect them frame by frame, we can get a better sense of how these effects actually work. There's a mix of 2D sketch art over the car vehicle during certain gameplay moments, like the stars and circles here or these angel wings. This appears to be billboarded 2D art that changes position each frame but doesn't change shape or rotation. Different brushstroke styles provide some variety here, so some of these effects have a chalky look, and others look sketched with a pencil or a marker. Then there are the more typical 3D keyframed effects. Tire smoke and certain elements around the car fall into this category. These tend to have a smoother appearance and often mimic the look of cel shading, though sometimes with overlaid cross-hatching or a comic book style dot effect. I was worried initially that these flourishes might be overwhelming, but they're actually used somewhat sparingly to highlight certain key gameplay actions, like drifting or colliding with another vehicle. They end up adding a lot of impact and excitement to a game that otherwise might be a little bit hard to differentiate from other recent racing titles. The game's other stylistic standout is its use of cel-shaded character models. Typically, there are a few different levels of shading, with characters often silhouetted with a bright, strong highlight, so they do tend to have a pretty three-dimensional appearance relative to some other uses of cel shading in modern games. Generally, I like the way these characters look, even if they can look slightly awkward juxtaposed against the more realistic environmental artwork. During most gameplay, these characters are sort of hard to notice, but they take center stage during the game's many cutscene sequences. Yes, this is an extremely plot-heavy game with a ton of dialogue, like recent Need for Speed entries, and very much unlike Hot Pursuit and Most Wanted, which had essentially no story whatsoever. I personally prefer the more laid-back approach of Criterion's earlier Need for Speed titles, but tastes will vary on this front. Once you put Unbound's unique visual elements aside, the rest of the game unfolds much more realistically, with conventionally shaded car models and environments. There are definitely some strong graphical highlights here, however. Like recent series entries, Unbound uses DICE's Frostbite game engine, though the results are much improved relative to those titles, I would say. Lighting quality is strong across the open world, for instance. The global illumination does a pretty good job here. There's a good approximation of light bounce even in more challenging areas, like under overpasses or in tunnels. It's not perfect and does have obvious issues when subject to close scrutiny, but for an open world racing game, the ambient lighting manages to look quite coherent. Compared with Need for Speed Heat, the last series entry, the improvements are quite profound. Heat really struggled to produce convincing results in indirectly lit conditions, and often looked very flat. Unbound produces a subtle, rich result by comparison, with good bounce and brightness levels. This was probably the weakest element of recent Need for Speed titles, and it's great to see Criterion make big strides. Plus, there are other subtle lighting details that impress, like accurate-looking shading on foliage, and player car headlights that cast two shadows against the environment, which converge and diverge realistically. Environmental assets mostly look good as well. Even subject to close inspection in the game's photo mode, there are some fairly high poly assets here, with trees and natural ground detail impressing in particular. It's not exactly Forza Horizon 5, but the level of quality is consistently high and nothing really seems below par. In motion, the game usually looks excellent. A lot of this comes down to Unbound's high-quality motion blur, which presents without significant artifacting. LODs are also managed very effectively, and pop-in is fairly unobtrusive. At speed, it's hard to complain really. It's definitely one of the better-looking racing games released in recent times. I do have some minor quibbles with the visuals, however. The most visually obvious issue during typical gameplay comes down to the reflections, in my opinion. Like most other current racing titles, reflections are handled using a mix of cube maps and screen space reflections, which is generally a fine combination. But the screen space reflections are seemingly only used for very glossy reflections, like in puddles, leaving smaller environmental features without any sort of reflection on surfaces that might be reflective but have a slightly diffuse finish. A lot of the game's incidental bits of environmental geometry, as well as pedestrians and cars, end up looking a little bit out of place as a result during certain weather and lighting conditions. Some other recent racing titles have applied screen space reflections more liberally, which can produce this occlusion artifacting but manages to achieve more accurate reflection coverage. Reflections on the car hood in the bumper gameplay camera view are also cube map based, which doesn't look particularly flattering either. Again, in other titles this would typically be handled with SSR. Plus, there are a handful of visual issues that make the game seem slightly rough around the edges. Engaging boost, for instance, disables motion blur for the duration of the effect, which is a bit distracting. Most of the smaller objects in the environment are destructible, but some, like the railings, bushes, and smaller trees, pop out of existence when you hit them, instead of deforming or being replaced with multiple pieces of broken geometry. And screen space light shafts are everywhere and often seem to take the place of volumetric effects, which can look a bit odd. Overall though, I am definitely pleased with Unbound's presentation. Even though there isn't any obviously current gen tech here, the game does look impressive, especially in indirectly lit conditions, and I really like the stylistic flourishes during gameplay. The basic visual metrics for Need for Speed Unbound are fairly simple on the surface. Series X and PS5 both target 2160p, but do use dynamic resolution at times to ease GPU load. In intense scenes, I counted a low of 1800p on PS5 and 2016p on Series X. In typical play, PS5 is usually somewhat sub 4K, often around 1944p, while Series X is usually at a full 4K resolution. Series S scales down roughly as expected to what appears to be a dynamic 1440p. The resolution range is somewhat wider here though, and the console can dip as low as 1080p in intense moments, often averaging around 1296p or so. But if you look closely at shots immediately after a camera cut, you can see some characteristic signs of reconstruction on certain screen elements, like on reflections and on some geometric edges and textures. It's hard to say for certain, but Frostbite titles often use checkerboarding on consoles, and I strongly suspect checkerboard rendering is in play in this game. Image quality is generally very good on the premium consoles, which looks suitably 4K-like from a typical viewing distance, though perhaps a little bit on the soft side. The Series S is a bit more questionable, however. It's somewhat softer and less detailed than the pixel counts would suggest, and it is possible to spot a fair bit of aliasing in motion, though the motion blur does a pretty good job of hiding most issues when at speed. Outside of resolution, there don't appear to be any significant visual differences between the consoles. Image quality is pretty good overall, so how do frame rates fare? All current-gen consoles aim for a 60 FPS target, though one is much more consistent than the rest. Xbox Series S and X hit 60 FPS most of the time, but do suffer from lapses. One-off frame drops are fairly common, a momentary 33 millisecond frame time interval at a 60Hz output, though this wasn't especially distracting in my testing. More severe framerate drops do occur occasionally, however, small clutches of dropped frames that can bring FPS readings down to the low 50s at worst. Both Xbox consoles show these drops in similar scenarios, mostly during busy races, and with about the same level of severity. PS5 on the other hand is much closer to a locked 60 FPS. It's not totally perfect as the one-off dropped frames are still present here, though they are less frequent, but the more noticeable dips don't seem to surface at all here even in intense races. It offers a significantly better performance level than the Xbox consoles. Perhaps the PS5's lower typical resolution relative to Series X is helping somewhat here, but whatever the case, the performance issues on Xbox really should be addressed even if that means taking an image quality hit. Between the various current-gen consoles, the PS5 offers the best overall experience at the moment. I love Criterion's older racing titles. Their Burnout games, as well as the aforementioned Need for Speed Hot Pursuit and Most Wanted, are some of my favorite arcade racers. So when it came to Unbound, I had high expectations as well as a bit of trepidation. After essentially a decade of support work on multiplayer shooters, would Criterion have the chops to produce another racing classic? I do think that Unbound is a better game than recent Need for Speed titles, and I've definitely enjoyed my time with the game so far, but it diverges from Criterion's earlier Need for Speed games in some key ways, and not always for the better. For one, the handling model is quite different. On the surface, it does seem pretty similar to a game like Hot Pursuit. Cars still drift effortlessly with a tap of the left trigger, and respond quickly to player inputs. But it's easier to lose control of your vehicle now, and drifting does cause a considerable speed loss. Unbound seems to be oriented more heavily around finding the right compromise in car tuning, balance, and driving style, with trade-offs all around. My impression is that the car handling feels more satisfying as you progress into faster vehicles, but the weaker cars don't always feel great. Personally, I would have loved to return to a more straightforward handling model, but I do think the cars feel good to control. It just takes a while to get used to. But I'm not really sold on the progression model in single player. After you complete the game's prologue sequence, you're left with a weak B-class vehicle and forced to earn money for upgrades and new cars through competing in races. Each race event only awards a few $1,000s for a good final position, however, and most good upgrades are very expensive. The early game feels unnecessarily slow and grindy as a result, and it can be difficult to keep ahead of other cars on straightaways without a heavily modified vehicle. And there are some presentational aspects that I'm not thrilled about, like the game's heavy emphasis on story and frequent dialogue when driving throughout the open world. I also don't personally care for the game's soundtrack, which is mostly composed of hip-hop music. Games like Hot Pursuit and Most Wanted had a more varied mix of songs that spanned a wide range of popular music, which I feel is a better approach for a mainstream driving game. However, I wouldn't have cared this much if there wasn't a good game here, and I do think that Unbound is an excellent arcade racer. Criterion has made a solid return to the genre that made them famous, with a Need for Speed game that's well worth playing. Outside of the occasional performance issues on Xbox Series consoles, I am pretty pleased with Unbound's graphical turnout as well. This isn't a boundary-pushing game necessarily, but it does present a convincing, well-lit open world with some bold artistic touches. If you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, and press the bell for YouTube notifications. Check out the Patreon at digitalfoundry.net for exclusive and early access content, and to get in touch, just use Twitter. Thanks for watching.